Italy, October 1944. A single machine gun nest had killed 17 men in 4 days, and no one could see where the bullets were coming from. The sun hung low over Monte Battaglia, casting long shadows across the ridgeline. The German position sat somewhere in that maze of stone and scrub. American infantry knew the general direction. They'd watch their comrades fall, watch the medics crawl forward, watch the dust kicked up by rounds that came from nowhere. But knowing the direction wasn't enough. The nest was invisible, camouflaged, protected by terrain that gave the shooter every advantage and the attackers none. 17 dead, 4 days, the ridge had to be taken. Staff Sergeant Vincent Romano sat behind his Browning M2050 caliber machine gun, studying the hillside through binoculars. He'd been at this for 6 hours. The problem was simple in theory, impossible in practice. The sniper fired from somewhere in a cluster of boulders roughly 400 yards upslope. But which boulder? Which gap? The rocks all looked the same. The shadows shifted with the sun. Every time a patrol moved forward, the sniper killed 1 or 2 men and went silent again. By the time anyone could return fire, there was nothing to shoot at. Romano was 23 years old. He'd grown up in Philadelphia, worked in his father's machine shop, joined the Army in 1942. He understood angles. He understood metal. He understood that every problem had a geometry to it, even if you couldn't see the full picture. The man beside him, Private Eddie Keller, spoke quietly. "Sarge, we've put maybe 2,000 rounds into those rocks. Haven't hit a damn thing." Romano lowered the binoculars. "That's because we've been shooting at rocks." Keller frowned. "What else is there?" Romano didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about ricochet, about deflection, about the way bullets behaved when they met hard surfaces at certain angles. In the machine shop, he'd watched drills skip off steel when the angle was wrong. He'd seen sparks fly in directions that didn't match the original force. Physics didn't care about intent. It cared about angles. The German sniper wasn't exposed. That much was obvious. He was firing from behind something. A crevice, a gap, a narrow opening that gave him a field of fire but kept him invisible. Standard suppression fire hadn't worked because it was hitting the front of the rocks, the surfaces the sniper wasn't behind. You couldn't hit a man by shooting at his shield, but you could hit him by shooting around it. Romano picked up the binoculars again. He traced the ridgeline from left to right, marking the cluster of boulders in his mind. The sniper's position had to offer a clear view of the American approach routes. That meant he was facing downslope, probably in a slight depression or behind an overhang. The surrounding rocks formed a natural shield. To hit him from the front was impossible, but rocks had more than one face. "Eddie, you see that tall boulder on the left? The one with the split top?" Keller nodded. "Yeah. Behind it and to the right, maybe 10 yards, there's a flat slab. Looks like it's leaning back into the hillside." Keller studied the terrain. "I see it. That's where he is." Keller looked skeptical. "You can't even see in there, Sarge." "I don't need to see in. I need to see what's next to it." Romano shifted his aim, traversing the M2 a fraction to the left. He wasn't targeting the flat slab. He was targeting the boulder beside it, the one with the angled face, the one that stood proud of the others. The geometry was basic. If he fired into the angled surface at the right point, the rounds wouldn't stop. They'd ricochet. They'd deflect into the space behind. Not all of them, maybe not even most of them, but some. It wasn't precision, it was probability. He adjusted the gun's elevation, compensating for the upward slope in the 400-yard distance. The M2 fired a 50 caliber BMG round, a bullet 12.7 millimeters wide, weighing roughly 46 grams, traveling at 2,900 feet per second. At that velocity, the round carried enough energy to punch through engine blocks. It could crack stone, and when it hit stone at the right angle, it didn't just stop. It fragmented, it tumbled, it turned into dozens of smaller projectiles, each one carrying a fraction of the original force, but still enough to kill. Romano had never done this before. He'd never fired blind at a ricochet angle and hoped the physics worked in his favor. But 17 men were dead, and the ridge had to be taken. And sometimes you acted on theory because waiting for certainty meant more funerals. He pressed the butterfly trigger. The M2 roared. 50 rounds cycled through in less than 8 seconds, a sustained burst that hammered into the angled boulder with mechanical precision. Romano watched the impacts through his binoculars, saw dust and chips explode from the rock face, saw the rounds hitting high and to the left of where the sniper was hidden. He didn't see the deflection itself. That happened too fast, at angles too sharp for the human eye. But he saw the result. The sniper's rifle clattered out from behind the flat slab, tumbling down the slope. A moment later, a body followed. It rolled twice, came to rest against a smaller rock, and didn't move. Silence settled over the hillside. Keller stared. Holy shit, you got him. Romano didn't reply immediately. He kept the binoculars trained on the position, waiting to see if there was a second shooter, waiting to see if this was a trick. But nothing moved. The nest was dead. After 30 seconds, Romano lowered the binoculars. Call it in. Tell them the ridge is clear. The word spread quickly through the American lines. The sniper who'd held up the advance for 4 days was dead. Patrols that had been pinned down could move again. Supply routes that had been interdicted could be used. The pressure on the entire sector eased, not because of a grand tactical maneuver, but because one machine gunner had understood that bullets don't always travel in straight lines. Lieutenant James Breslin, Romano's platoon commander, arrived at the gun position 20 minutes later. He was a West Point graduate, 25 years old, carrying a map case and a pair of worn binoculars. He'd lost 3 men to the sniper in the past 2 days. Good men. Men he'd trained with, eaten with, promised he'd keep alive. Romano, what did you do? Romano gestured toward the hillside. Ricochet fire, sir. Aimed at the rock next to his position, fragments got him. Breslin studied the terrain through his own binoculars, tracing the angle Romano had used. That's not in the manual. No, sir, it's not. Breslin lowered the binoculars and looked at Romano for a long moment. How'd you know it would work? Didn't know, sir. Just seemed like the only option left. Breslin nodded slowly. He understood what Romano wasn't saying, that sometimes the manual didn't cover the situation, that sometimes you had to improvise with whatever tools and knowledge you possessed, that sometimes the difference between success and failure was one man's willingness to try something no one else had thought of. Good work, Sergeant. I'll make sure it goes in the report. Romano said nothing. He didn't need recognition. He needed the ridge taken so they could move forward and maybe, eventually, go home. The technique Romano had used wasn't in any manual. It wasn't taught at training camps or discussed in after-action reports. It existed in the overlap between ballistics and intuition, in the mind of a man who understood that bullets obeyed laws even when the target didn't cooperate. The Army didn't have a name for it in 1944. Later, some would call it deflection fire. Others would call it indirect suppression. Romano never called it anything. He just called it the only option left. But the principle was sound, and other gunners would use it again. Monte Battaglia fell the next day. The American advance continued north, pushing toward the Po Valley. Romano's platoon took casualties in the weeks that followed, not from snipers, but from artillery, from mines, from the grinding attrition that defined the Italian campaign in its final year. Romano himself survived the war. He went home to Philadelphia, returned to the machine shop, and rarely spoke about what had happened on the ridge. When he did, he described it simply. A problem of angles, solved with 50 caliber rounds and a guess about physics. The sniper, it turned out, had been a German corporal named Klaus Weiss, 20 years old, a hunter from Bavaria who'd been drafted in 1943 and trained as a marksman. His position behind the flat slab had been nearly perfect, concealed from below, sheltered from direct fire, with clear sightlines to the American lines. He'd killed 17 men without taking a single shot in return, until Romano stopped shooting at him and started shooting at the stone beside him. Weiss's rifle was a Carabiner 98K, the standard German infantry weapon, fitted with a 4-power scope. It was recovered from the slope after the position fell. The weapon showed no damage. Weiss himself had been struck by at least 3 fragments from the ricocheted rounds, each one small enough to fit on a fingernail, but traveling fast enough to penetrate flesh and bone. The autopsy, conducted by an American medic, noted wounds to the chest and neck. He'd died within seconds. The deflection technique Romano employed would reappear in military doctrine years later, but not in the way he'd used it. By the Korean War, Machine gunners were being taught to use ricochets deliberately when fighting in rocky terrain, firing at the ground in front of enemy positions to create a fan of low-angle fragments. It wasn't always effective. Terrain varied. Rocks didn't always break the right way. But in certain conditions, it worked. And it worked because the principle was correct. Bullets don't stop just because they hit something hard. They change direction. They break apart. They turn one projectile into many. The M2 Browning itself became a legend. Designed by John Moses Browning in 1918, it entered service in 1933 and was still in use 90 years later. It fired from an open bolt, using a short recoil system that cycled the action automatically. The weapon weighed 84 pounds without its tripod, making it too heavy for one man to carry comfortably, but stable enough to deliver accurate fire at long range. Its effective range was listed as 1,800 meters for area targets, though skilled gunners could hit point targets beyond 1,000. The round it fired, the .50 caliber BMG, was designed to defeat light armor and aircraft. Against infantry, it was devastatingly effective. Against stone, it was unpredictable. Romano's squad never discussed the physics of what had happened. They didn't need to. They'd watch the sniper's rifle fall. They'd watch the body tumble. That was evidence enough. But the event stayed with them, not as a story to retell, but as a reminder that war was fought with tools and geometry as much as courage. You could be brave and still lose. You could be smart and still die. But sometimes, if you understood the tools and the terrain, you could solve a problem no one else had figured out. The days following the sniper's death brought their own challenges. The Germans, recognizing that their defensive position had collapsed, withdrew to secondary fortifications 3 kilometers north. The American infantry pursued, moving through terrain that offered concealment to defenders and exposure to attackers. Romano's machine gun team moved with them, the M2 broken down into components and carried by 3 men, Romano with the barrel and receiver, Keller with the tripod, and Private Joseph Martinez with the ammunition cans. Each can held 100 rounds linked in belts. Martinez carried 6 cans, 12 pounds per can, 72 pounds of ammunition, plus his rifle, his pack, his water. He was 19 years old, from El Paso, Texas. He joined the Army the day after his 18th birthday. He never complained about the weight. None of them did. Complaining didn't make the load lighter. They dug in on a hillside overlooking a valley where German supply trucks moved at night. Romano set up the gun in a shallow depression, piling rocks around the position to create a firing platform that offered protection and stability. The M2 required both. Its recoil, while manageable, was substantial enough that firing from an unstable position would scatter rounds across a wide area. Accuracy at range demanded a solid foundation. That night, Romano and Keller took turns on watch. The valley below remained dark, no vehicle lights, no movement they could detect. But the Germans were there. Intelligence reports confirmed it. They were consolidating, regrouping, preparing for the next phase of defense. The war wasn't over. It was just pausing. At 0200 hours, Keller nudged Romano awake. Movement. 3 o'clock. Maybe 1,000 meters. Romano came fully alert, scanning the darkness with night-adapted eyes. He saw nothing at first. Then, faintly, a shift in the shadows, something moving against the static landscape. He reached for the binoculars, brought them to his eyes, and waited for his vision to resolve the shapes. Trucks, 6 of them, moving without lights along a narrow road that cut through the valley floor. German supply convoy, trying to reach forward positions under cover of darkness. Standard procedure, smart procedure, but not smart enough. Romano calculated the range. The lead truck was moving at perhaps 30 kilometers per hour. The road curved gently, offering a predictable path. He'd have maybe 20 seconds of opportunity before the convoy reached a section of road obscured by trees. He didn't need 20 seconds. He needed 5. Eddie, load a belt, high explosive incendiary. Keller fed the belt into the receiver, pulled the charging handle twice, and tapped Romano's shoulder. Ready. Romano aimed not at the lead truck, but at the road 50 meters ahead of it, leading the target, compensating for travel time, for drop, for the slight crosswind that moved through the valley. The M2's sights were crude by modern standards, a simple post at the front, a notch at the rear, But Romano had fired thousands of rounds through this gun. He knew how it behaved. He knew where the rounds would go. He pressed the trigger. 15 rounds in 3 seconds, a short burst, enough to confirm the range and trajectory. He watched the tracers arc through the darkness, saw them impact the road surface just as the lead truck reached that point. One round punched through the hood. The truck swerved, slowed, stopped. The convoy behind it stopped as well. Traffic jam, confusion, perfect. Romano fired again. 30 rounds this time, traversing from left to right, walking the fire across the stopped vehicles. High explosive incendiary rounds didn't just penetrate, they ignited. Fuel tanks erupted. Canvas covers caught fire. Within 15 seconds, 3 trucks were burning, and the valley was lit by flames that turned night into flickering orange day. The Germans scrambled. Men poured from the vehicles, running for cover, trying to escape the kill zone. Romano didn't pursue them with fire. His target had been the supplies, the logistics that kept the enemy fighting. The men were secondary. Let them run. They couldn't carry much. The convoy burned for 40 minutes. By dawn, it was twisted metal and ash. American patrols moved through at first light, documenting the damage. 6 trucks destroyed. Ammunition, fuel, and food supplies eliminated. The German units those trucks had been meant to resupply would go without. The pressure on their defensive line increased. Romano's action report described the engagement in 2 sentences. Enemy convoy engaged at approximately 0200 hours. 6 vehicles destroyed. No mention of the deflection technique he'd used at Monte Battaglia. That was a different action, a different report, but the same principles applied. See the problem, understand the tools, apply physics to outcome, war reduced to mathematics and metal. The ridge at Monte Battaglia sits quiet now. Markers indicate where units fought, where men fell, where the line moved forward or stalled. Tourists visit in summer, walking the same paths the infantry climbed under fire. The boulders are still there. The flat slab still leans into the hillside. There's no plaque for Klaus Weiss. There's no marker for Vincent Romano. The war moved on, as wars do, leaving behind only the landscape and the memory of what happened when 17 deaths demanded a solution and a machine gunner with a background in metalwork thought about angles instead of firepower. Romano returned home in 1945. He married in 1947 a woman named Catherine who'd worked in a defense plant during the war, assembling artillery shells. They understood each other's silences. She didn't ask about Italy. He didn't volunteer. They built a life that had nothing to do with ridges or ricochets or the geometry of killing. 3 children, a house in northeast Philadelphia, Sunday dinners with relatives, the ordinary rhythm of peacetime. Romano worked in his father's machine shop until 1978, when arthritis forced him to retire. By then, the shop had expanded to employ 12 people, producing precision parts for industrial machinery. Romano ran the lathe section, training younger machinists in techniques that required patience and understanding of how metal behaved under stress. He was good at it. Patient. Exacting. The same qualities that had made him a good machine gunner. He died in 1993, at the age of 72. His obituary in the Philadelphia Inquirer mentioned his family, his work, his service in World War II. It didn't mention Monte Battaglia. It didn't mention the deflection shot that ended a sniper's killing spree. Those details existed only in military records filed decades earlier, archived in facilities where historians occasionally discovered them and wondered about the stories behind the terse language. The Browning M2 is still in service. Variants of the original design fire from vehicles, helicopters, and fixed positions around the world. The basic mechanism hasn't changed. The round is the same. The weapon remains effective for the same reasons it was effective in 1944. It's reliable, powerful, and built to tolerances that allow it to function in conditions that destroy lesser tools. Romano's gun, serial number lost to records that no longer exist, was likely melted down after the war, recycled into something else. The .50 caliber rounds he fired into that boulder are still there, buried in fragments too small to recover, oxidized into rust by 80 years of weather. The German military, by October 1944, was contracting. Italy was a secondary front, its strategic value diminished by the Allied breakout in France and the Soviet advance in the East. The soldiers left to defend the Gothic line were a mixture of veterans, conscripts, and exhausted men who knew the war was lost, but fought anyway because retreat wasn't an option, and surrender meant prison or worse. Klaus Weiss was one of thousands. His skill as a marksman gave him value, kept him alive longer than many of his comrades, but it couldn't protect him from a bullet he never saw coming. The 17 men Weiss killed had names, families, futures that ended on a hillside in Italy because one man with a rifle occupied terrain that gave him every advantage. Private Thomas Henley, 21, from Iowa. Corporal Michael Russo, 24, from New York. Private First Class David Chen, 20, from California. The list continues, each name representing a life interrupted, a family that received a telegram, a grave marked in a military cemetery, or a body that never came home. Their deaths were not meaningless. They occurred in service of an objective deemed strategically necessary by commanders operating within a larger framework of operations designed to defeat Nazi Germany. But on the ground, in the moment, their deaths felt senseless, invisible enemy. No way to fight back, just the sudden crack of a rifle and another man down. Romano's shot changed that equation. It gave the survivors agency. It proved that even an invisible enemy occupying perfect terrain could be defeated if someone understood the physics well enough. That lesson mattered. It spread through the unit, then through the division, then into the collective knowledge that soldiers carry and pass on. You can't always see the enemy, but you can see the terrain. And if you understand how weapons behave in that terrain, you can find solutions. Romano didn't think of himself as special. When asked about the war, he described it as something that had to be done. The shot on the ridge was one moment in a campaign that lasted months, in a war that lasted years. He didn't frame it as heroism. He framed it as problem-solving. There was a target. He couldn't hit it directly, so he changed the angle. That clarity is rare. War is often described in terms of chaos, fear, and improvisation, but within the chaos there are moments of cold logic, moments when training and experience converge with necessity and produce solutions that look, in hindsight, like brilliance. Romano's shot was one of those moments. It wasn't luck. It wasn't desperation. It was a man using the tools he understood to solve a problem no one else had solved because 17 men were dead, and the ridge had to be taken, and waiting for someone else to figure it out wasn't an option. The deflection principle works because stone is hard but not uniform. When a high-velocity round strikes rock, the impact generates fractures that propagate through the material faster than the bullet itself. The round may shatter, it may deform, it may ricochet cleanly or tumble chaotically. The outcome depends on angle, velocity, composition of the stone, and a dozen other variables that can't be predicted with certainty. But in aggregate, across multiple rounds, the probability of a fragment reaching a concealed target increases. Romano didn't calculate that probability. He intuited it, and he was right. The American advance through Italy continued into 1945. The Gothic line fell. The Po Valley was taken. Germany surrendered in May. The war in Europe ended, and the men who'd fought in it went home. Some thrived, some struggled, some never spoke about what they'd seen. Romano was somewhere in the middle, he remembered. He didn't dwell. He built a life that had nothing to do with war, but the shot stayed in the records, a footnote. A single action report filed by Lieutenant Breslin, who noted that effective suppression fire had eliminated a sniper position on October 14, 1944. No details, no analysis, just the fact of it, preserved in archives that historians would comb through decades later, trying to reconstruct what happened on hillsides that no longer mattered to anyone but the families of the men who died there. Monte Battaglia is green now. The rocks remain, the sight lines remain. Stand where Romano stood, and you can still see the cluster of boulders upslope. You can trace the angle. You can imagine the .50 caliber rounds hammering into stone, fragmenting, deflecting, turning one man's understanding of physics into another man's death. It's quiet there. Wind moves through the scrub. Birds call. The war is gone, but the landscape remembers. Romano fired 50 rounds in 8 seconds and ended a siege that had cost 17 lives. He didn't celebrate. He didn't boast. He called it in, waited to confirm the kill, and moved on to the next objective. That's what soldiers did. That's what the war demanded. There was always another ridge, always another problem, always another reason to think about angles. The story doesn't scale to grand strategy. It doesn't change how we understand the Italian campaign or the broader arc of the Second World War. It's too small for that. But it matters because it's specific. It happened to real men in a real place. It was solved with real tools and real thinking. And in a war, often remembered for its scale and horror, the small moments, the problems solved by individuals using whatever they had, deserve their own attention. Romano's deflection shot is one of those moments. 17 men dead, one gunner with an idea about ricochets, 50 rounds fired at stone, a sniper's rifle falling down a slope. The war moved on. The men who survived remembered. And somewhere in the archives, a 2-sentence report records that on October 14, 1944, effective suppression fire eliminated an enemy position that had held up an advance for 4 days. That's all. That's enough.